Welcome to Lyric Lab Poetry. My name's Martin Jago. This video is a how to set up and facilitate your very own public poetry workshop kind of video. So please keep watching. Now, the first thing to say about public poetry workshops is that there are usually two kinds of public poetry workshop. The first one is a generative type of workshop in which the facilitator provides writing prompts and the assembled participants or attendees, they get writing poetry right from the get-go. So you can imagine that's quite labor-intensive for the facilitator, a bit like some of the Lyric Lab poetry videos in this series. There are lots of poetry prompts and literary devices, of sort of exploration of devices and how best to put them to use. So that is the generative model, the generative poetry workshop. But in this video, I want to talk about the sort of MFA style poetry workshop, which I'll explain in a bit more detail. And I have some guidelines here of a poetry workshop I've just launched with my local branch library, about 5 minutes down the road in that direction. And this comes on the back of having facilitated a public poetry workshop through the Central Branch Library in downtown Los Angeles for about a year. So I thought it might be useful because one of the best ways of developing your poetry, of course, is to share it and receive some constructive feedback and critique. It's not always best to share it with your mum, because your mum's always going to say, "It's a lovely poem, Jimmy, very lovely." I think being in a group where people are going to respond critically to the work is a really healthy thing. Not always a healthy thing, because of course the thing about a public poetry workshop is that you're going to encounter all kinds of different people from different backgrounds and all different personality types as well. And some people seem to feel the need to respond or critique other poets' work as if they were bludgeoning them to death. So we've spoken a little bit about the generative type of poetry workshop, and now let's talk about the MFA style workshop. And the way that works is that you bring with you to a poetry workshop a work in progress poem that you're working on. So let me refer to my poetry guidelines. The first thing I would say about this is that a public poetry workshop should be something that's held in a public space. And that's why I think it's very good to go through your local branch library. If they have a separate study room or a room that maybe is used for events that's not part of the main library, that would be ideal. And because it's a free poetry workshop, you are volunteering your time, and the library therefore is providing the space for the community use, which therefore means it is free. So you're not out of pocket. Basically, the outline of the workshop, I start my guidelines, and I don't call them rules because I'm not there to be the boss of anyone, and I don't want to be. I want to try to get out of the way of the poetry and the poets. But I find that guidelines are helpful, and there will be times when you may need to refer certain poets to certain guidelines. We'll come to that very shortly. But first I start with an outline, and I print off copies of this and share this among the participants. The poetry workshop invites new and seasoned poets to share new work and provide feedback. And ideally this is a 2-hour workshop, because if you have around about 10 participants and you're there for 120 minutes, if you have 10 to 12 participants, that's plenty of time for each poet to read their poem and receive feedback. I think 10 or 12 is a maximum, really. The poets should bring with them a new poem that they're working on, that they wish to share, and they should bring additional copies that they are going to distribute among the other poetry workshop participants, and a pen, of course. So it's a 2-hour in person, but there's no reason why this format wouldn't work online over Zoom. I prefer an in-person experience. And the workshop should begin with the facilitator just going over the guidelines, which is what I'm essentially doing now. And then the first poet reads their poem out loud. Everyone else listens, and while they're listening, they're looking at the poem, they have the additional copy in front of them, they're making notes on that piece of paper. It could be anything. It could be that the title sucks, and that you feel that the poem's very strong, but the title there needs to be a stronger title. It could be any thought or reflection you have on what the poem is trying to do, how well it is succeeding at that, whether you find particular language surplus to the poem. In other words, could it be cut? You might identify certain cliches that you think should not be there. Anything you think might be helpful and constructive. After that, the facilitator initiates a feedback discussion where participants can share some of those notes, or it may be as someone else is commenting on the poem that's being discussed. That might, you might bring ideas that you can then add to your notes. And during the feedback, it's very important, in my opinion, that the poet is not called on to speak, avoiding a back and forth between the facilitator and the poet, or the poet and other session attendees. The poet is not expected to justify, defend, or to explain their work in any way, but having shared it, they should, use this part of the session to reflect on the feedback being provided. I think that's very important, because when you open a book or a magazine and read a poem, you do not and never will have the poet standing over your shoulder explaining, well, this bit here, what I intended was that the reader would understand it as this or that. If the poet is able to put that idea into your head before you've even read the poem, I think that's a mistake. That's just a personal opinion, and all I'm sharing here is my workshop guidelines that you don't have to follow, that you could adapt or change or ignore completely. After that brief discussion, we then move on to the next poet, and the same thing happens. They read out their poem out loud, and the group offers feedback. Let's talk about some do's and don'ts. It's really important that the space that you're in, the shared space, feels like a safe space for poetry participants. So that means that you want participants to interact in a respectful, constructive, and considerate manner, and so therefore racist, sexist, transphobic, homophobic, abusive, or derogatory language should really not be tolerated. And as the facilitator, you should call that out. And also, of course, you have the right to eject someone from that workshop if you feel that their behavior is not doing what the workshop sets out to do, which is to create a safe and secure environment in which those participants feel comfortable. Because it really is an act of bravery to stand up in front of strangers and share bare your soul and share your poem. And we're very sensitive creatures. We want feedback and constructive critique. Maybe we sense the poem isn't finished and it needs work. And we need to be able to do that in an environment that supports that facilitates that. I also ask that poets include content warnings for poems that contain material that perhaps relates to any of the following. It could be any kind of violence, abuse, trauma, self-harm, suicide, sexual assault, substance abuse, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, or any other sensitive topics. It may be, for example, a trans poet relates an experience of transphobia, or that a survivor of childhood sexual abuse relates a poem that kind of delves into that. A content warning could appear on the top of the poem, on the copies that the participants provide each other, or it could be a verbal warning ahead of the poem. I just think it's a very helpful thing for poets to provide that ahead, to give a kind of heads up before we get to content that could be essentially triggering for other people in the group. Another key aspect of the poetry workshop, and something of an elephant in the room, is offering feedback, more specifically how we offer feedback, because some people are just really bad at doing that, and they have a very prescriptive approach to delivering their feedback, as if they are the keeper of all knowledge on how this poem should be or how it should progress. And I have a sentence here in my guidelines that I find particularly useful to share with poetry workshop participants. We really want to help the presenting poet achieve their best version of their poem, not our best version of their poem. So we have to try and understand what the poet is trying to achieve and try and find a way to that in the feedback that we offer. It is also very useful to bookend criticism with observations, positive observations you made, things you liked about the poem. And I think that really is the sort of rough overview of the guidelines I provide in a poetry workshop. So there you are. I hope you enjoyed the video and hope it's of some use if you were considering setting up your very own public poetry workshop. Here's another very important thing to say. You don't need to be a poet, an established poet. You don't need to have published any poem to run or facilitate a poetry workshop. You just need to have the confidence to do it. You could be an emerging poet, passionate about poetry and about creating a public space where people can come and share their work. That's all you need to have. Thank you for watching. I'll be back soon with more poetry content.